This evening, Book Passage is proud to welcome best-selling author Les Standiford. Les has written over 20 books, including The Last Train to Paradise, Bringing Adam Home, and the John Deal Mystery Series. His latest book, Water to the Angels, is a thoroughly researched, fascinating look into the life and work of William Mulholland, the engineer who designed and spearheaded the creation of the California Aqueduct. The aqueduct was a lifeline to the desert of Southern California, and it provided the resources for Los Angeles to become the incredible metropolis it is today. Water to the Angels brings the characters, the time, and the place to vivid life, enlightening readers to this very pivotal moment in history. So please join with me in a warm welcome for Les Standiford.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanna. I have to share this with you. I've been on the road for about a week now, and I'm always getting these messages out of left field. This one came in from a young man named Gabriel, who told me that he was a high school student working on a project. He had some questions about writing. Would I mind answering them? Could he call me? I said, Gabriel, I'm actually traveling. I'm out in California. I live in Miami. But you could email me your questions. So he did. And I opened up the email with the questions, and I see that there's, dear Mr. Standiford, thank you very much. There's a list of, there must be 12 questions. I begin to read them. Wonder what he's got in his mind. First one, please provide your full name and your title. Okay, I can do that. Question 2, what is art? I didn't even go to question 3.
Well, what is art, though?
So I thought that I'd actually answer that question here tonight. The fact is that this is something of a turn for me, although it's not been a recent turn. I started off as a novelist, wrote 10 novels, in fact, before I made my way into history and narrative history, as I like to say. I, in fact, don't think I could have written those histories or any kind of history that anyone would have been able to read or been interested in reading if I hadn't started off as a storyteller, because what I try to do, what I look for is a good story. And the only difference is that I've been telling stories that are true. I explain to my students, they sometimes say, well, what is the difference? And I said, well, when you're writing a novel and you get to a point where you need a fact, you can just make it up. It's fiction after all. But in these pieces, why you get to a point where you're trying to carry out a narrative that will interest people, and you don't have that fact, then back to your sources you must go, or the library. And if you can't find that fact, then you've got to change your story to fit the facts you do have. Suppose it's something that any reporter worth their salt could have told me to begin with, but it was something of an eye-opener for yours truly. But I enjoy it. I enjoy the challenge of being able to take a stack of facts and figures and transform them into a narrative that I hope is compelling and convincing. And it is all true. You can't make anything up. This story I was turned on to by a chance comment of Robert Towns in a couple of years, maybe after Chinatown came out back in the 1970s. They had won the Academy Award. He'd won the Academy Award for screenplay. And somebody was talking to him about where he got the idea, and he was talking a little bit about the history, but since I wasn't aware of it, I wasn't too tuned in. But I did perk up when he said this, I wished I'd been able to tell the real story behind Chinatown, because the truth is just as interesting, I thought, as what we made up. Well, when it came time a few years ago to move on to another writing project, that comment of Towns popped in my head. Wonder what he's talking about. If Robert Towne, the Academy Award winning screenwriter of Chinatown, thinks there's a true story lying around out there that's just as good as Chinatown, wow, and nobody's still told it. There have been books about California water politics, of course, but the narrative of what William Mulholland accomplished 100 or so years ago has not been told. A couple of books back in the 1940s were written, but a lot has happened since then. And the more I read, the more I became convinced that this was a story that needed to be told. I've always enjoyed telling stories that people think they know a little bit about, but don't understand the whole story. There was an old radio program that I used to like. Paul Harvey would come on and he'd start talking about something that some woman had done, some housewife, he would call her. And she'd gotten herself in some amazing trouble or looked like she was going to accomplish something amazing. And then he'd say, well, of course I'm talking about Martha Washington. And I'll be back in a moment with the rest of the story. And I loved that. I loved that story. Well, that's how I happen to be here with you this evening. I pulled down that rabbit warren of the story of the accomplishments of William Mulholland. I've got a little something I want to share with you, and when I'm finished with that, I'm sure we'll have time for any questions or comments that you might have. But let me shift gears here for a minute and share this with you. I used to believe that if you were lucky enough to have written a book, found a publisher for it, what you did then was retire to your chambers and write another book. But I discovered that that's not the way it works. The publisher actually expects you to go out and help sell the thing. And it's not that I mind coming to nice places like this and meeting folks such as yourself who actually have an interest in what it is I do, but sometimes it goes further than that. As Last Train to Paradise was being prepared for publication, it's the story of the building of a railroad from Miami to Key West across about 150 miles of open water. It formed the base of US 1 today, and some of you may have made that drive. If you haven't, put it on your bucket list. At any rate, as that book was about to be published, I got a call from the publicist at the publisher, a guy named Brandon Perlberg, and he said, Les, good news. I said, what's that, Brandon? He says, well, there's a chance we can get you on one of the morning shows with this book. And I said, well, great. And he said, yeah, but. And you come to understand there's always a but with these things. I said, well, what is it, Brandon? He said, well, they want a news angle. I said, a news angle? All this stuff happened 100 years ago. He said, yeah, but it's a news show and they need a news angle, so come up with one, get back to me when you got it. So what I had to do was retire to my chambers, try to come up with a news angle for this century-old story. And try as I might, I really couldn't come up with much of anything, but I was bound and determined to prove that if I had the chance for a conversation with Charles Gibson, and they let it slip by then who it was. He was at the time the anchor for Good Morning America. He was a reader. He had authors on a regular basis, and it was clear to me that he had always read the books that he was talking to the people about. He was interested. So what I did was sit down to, just in case the real thing should never happen, construct my own interview with Charles Gibson on Good Morning America to prove that I was capable of holding up my hand with Charlie. Well, the fact is that real interview never took place, but I was so happy with the way the fictitious one turned out that I took it with me everywhere I went on the tour. And it began a kind of tradition, which I've continued to this day. I've decided that I'm not going to wait for Good Morning America. I'm just going to go straight to my version of things. So if you'll grant me the favor, that time-honored favor, the suspension of your disbelief, and imagine that there's a big television screen up here around me, and the Depends commercial has just faded softly away. We've heard the last iteration of the intentions of Bruce Jenner to be all that he can be. And the next voice you hear will be that of Charles Gibson. Still an anchorman, still reading books, still interviewing intrepid authors. As temperatures continue to rise in Los Angeles, a record 103 degrees this past September, wildfires threaten to envelop more residential property. The prospect of a serious long-term drought becomes more likely. There were storms in February that dumped several inches of water on the ground, but the real source of year-round water in the region comes from the Sierra Nevada snowpack, and there has not been enough snow this winter to replenish that source, which was yielding about 20% of normal last summer. Governor Jerry Brown has just issued first mandatory water use restrictions for the entire state, first ones ever. While the water crisis in California heightens, a new book takes readers on a journey to the early years of the 20th century when Los Angeles, then a dusty outpost, first began to grapple with the question of how to keep from drying up. With us here to share the story of how Californians responded to their first brush with drought's catastrophe is Les Standiford, author of Water to the Angels, William Mulholland, his monumental aqueduct, and the rise of Los Angeles. And here I might point out that you have the best thing about being a writer. If you're not happy with the way your reality is turning out, you can just rewrite it. Question, or should I say Charlie? Les, you wrote 10 novels before you turned to several works of nonfiction. What drew you away from making it up into history? Well, Charlie, these true stories I've been telling seem to me just as good as anything I might have dreamed up on my own. In fact, if you'd actually had me on your show back when Last Train to Paradise came out, you'd remember what I told you then. One of the richest men in the country, Henry Flagler, ramrods the engineering project of the century, that railroad I was telling you about, and then in 1935, the worst hurricane in history up to that point wiped it all away. I thought that would be a lot more interesting story than one about how an investment banker stole all his clients' money and then built himself a really big house. In the present case, there are some significant parallels to Last Train to Paradise. William Mulholland, a penniless Irish immigrant who'd never gone to high school, much less taken any coursework in engineering, designed and built the impossible Los Angeles aqueduct between 1907 and 1913, moving an entire river from the mountains of central California 233 miles southward to Los Angeles, over deserts, across chasms, and through more mountains. Los Angeles had about 100,000 citizens at the time Mulholland began his work and had been in the grip of a drought for a dozen years or so. The place was tapped out in terms of water supply and seemed destined to stay just one more dusty town along the coast until Mulholland brought the water. Today, of course, Los Angeles has become one of the dominant cities in the world with about 10 million or so living in the basin. Question. Well, if Mulholland pulled that off, why aren't we more familiar with him today? Answer. Well, that's a real good question, Charlie. Of course, a lot of people know Mulholland Drive, the spectacular road that runs along the crest of the Hollywood Hills, and there's actually a Mulholland Middle School somewhere in LA, I've never seen it, a Mulholland pumping station and some other things, Memorial Fountain on Los Feliz Drive. But you're right in that Mulholland himself doesn't get a lot of press these days. A lot of it has to do with what I like to call the Chinatown syndrome. Question. You're talking about the Academy Award-winning film that stars Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway? Answer. It is a classic and it's one of my favorites. And the film uses what are sometimes called the California Water Wars as an historical backdrop. But in the movie, the fictional character of Water Commissioner Hollis Mulray is a stand-in for William Mulholland, and he is portrayed as a colorless pipsqueak who is easily dispatched by powerful bad guy developer Noah Cross, played so well by John Huston. I'm sure some of you remember that. So far as the real history of LA is concerned, though, the film doesn't have much correspondence to what really happened. I like to say that it has about as much correspondence to the true facts as Donald Duck has to ducks. But Chinatown is set in the 1930s for one thing. Mulholland did the bulk of his work between 1905 and 1915. And while the subplot of the movie suggests that there was a conspiracy between businessmen such as Noah Cross and the city and Mulholland to build the aqueduct and line the pockets of the corrupt, there is no evidence, and there has never been any produced, to support such charges. Question: Mulholland was never accused of taking a bribe? Answer: he was honest to a fault. All he ever got out of building the aqueduct was his civil servant salary, which was bumped up to $15,000 a year as he was doing the work. Politicians came to him in the aftermath of the aqueduct's completion and asked him to run for mayor. Business interests wanted somebody that could defeat a promising progressive candidate. Mulholland was the most popular individual in Los Angeles at the time and could have won the election in a walk. His response was typical Mulholland, though. Mayor, he said, I'd rather give birth to a porcupine backward. He had a million of these lines. I could do one of those little books, The Wit and Wisdom of Bill Mulholland. Another one I'll share with you. Once when he had finished the aqueduct, and his driver, George Behar, this is something I dug out of the ash heap of history, had driven him up to Oregon to do some dam consulting work, and when they were finished, back they headed for Los Angeles, and they stopped for dinner someplace south of Pendleton, and a little roadside diner, and the waitress ran out with her pen and pad poised and announced to Behar and Mulholland that the special of the evening was codfish balls. Behar says that Mulholland didn't skip a beat. He looked up at her and said, "Oh yes, that's the best part of the fish." Harrison Gray Otis, publisher of the LA Times, his son-in-law Harry Chandler, a developer named Moses Sherman, and some others did buy up quite a bit of property in the San Fernando Valley in advance of the aqueduct's completion, and they did profit mightily. But that had nothing to do with Mulholland. He decried such speculation. But, as he also said, show me a place to bring the water where someone doesn't own the land, and I'll take it there. All Mulholland cared about was bringing water to a place that he'd fallen in love with. He came to Los Angeles and started work as a ditch digger in the 1870s when there were only a few thousand residents and disputes were still being resolved by shootouts in the streets. Mulholland outlived Wyatt Earp, for instance, by 6 years. That would be some sense of a marker of when he lived. He worked himself up to become the superintendent of the private water company that sold the city its water, and when the city bought that company out, they brought Mulholland, the well-known brains of the outfit, along with it. One of the other legendary stories is that they were grilling him, the city, about what the holdings of the private Los Angeles Water Company really were. How many pipes, how big, just exactly what was the city going to get for its money in terms of tangible assets. And they wanted a map of the system. Mulholland says they wanted to know where all the major lines ran. And Mulholland says, well, do you have a city map here? Being the commission chambers, they said, oh yeah, we can get your map. He said, well, bring it out. So they bring out a map and put it on an easel, and he gets a pencil and proceeds to sketch from memory the entirety of the Los Angeles water system at the time. Seemed impressive, but the commissioners were a little doubtful, and they said, well, Mr. Mulholland, you wouldn't mind if we actually went out to some of these locations where you say there are pipes and check to see how big they are and what kind of shape they're in. And he said, no, I wouldn't mind at all. Where do you want to look? Well, mark them on the map and go dig. Well, they marked 100 locations on the map that Mulholland had drawn from memory. And they went out and they dug up all 100 places, and they found exactly there in each place what Mulholland had said was there. Well, that settled the matter. But Mulholland at that point gained credibility not only with the people but with politicians as being a man who knew wherever he spoke. Question. So where did the idea come from, diverting the Owens River from all the way up by the Mammoth Ski area east of San Francisco? Answer. Mulholland gave credit to a former mayor of Los Angeles, Fred Eaton, who had floated the idea of using Owens Valley water to irrigate lands down by Mojave. Originally, the water did flow through a gap in the mountains there. That's how China Lake got the name China Lake after all. Water flowed down there from the Owens Valley, pooled, and then dried in the summer. There was no outlet from there. Then an earthquake eons ago blocked that egress, and Owens Lake became the reality. That's where the Owens River terminated, and it would fill up in the summer, or in the winter, and dry up in the summer, and became a pretty alkaline lake. But the river was always running after the snow melt, pristine and full, with a lot of water. But until Mulholland and Eaton, until things got so bad, nobody ever took Eaton seriously. Mulholland had done his best to institute water conservation measures in Los Angeles, the first person to ever do so. In fact, the private water company cared about one thing, and that was profits. He had a heck of a time getting them to turn any money back into the system, and he was always trying to, there were wooden pipes, pipes made of wood when Mulholland first came to work for that company. Those have to be replaced. Well, if we have to, Bill, that kind of thing. And he was the first person to have water meters installed on customers' lines in Los Angeles. They were not, there wasn't a reliable water meter until 1985, and he was the first one to bring them to Los Angeles. Because his research showed him that customers' water usage dropped in half once they were being charged for everything they used. Put an end to a great deal of waste. And he had some other conservation measures, but at any rate, he tried everything he could, and he said it didn't matter how low they got the per capita water consumption in the city per day if the people wouldn't stop coming. If the population doubled, it didn't matter if you'd cut the water per person usage of water in half. It balanced out, made everything move. Well, the commissioner said, well, what do you think we ought to do about it, Bill? He said, I'm not sure. Maybe have the president of the Chamber of Commerce shot? Well, that was reported in the newspapers at the time. The commissioners demurred on that, but backed Mulholland in to a corner, and he went to Fred Eaton and said, Fred, maybe it's time that you showed me this river that you've been talking about since back in the 1990s. And Fred said, I'd be happy to. They rented a buckboard and drove from up over a dirt road across the desert from Los Angeles. It was said that you could trace their path by the glint of the whiskey bottles they tossed off the buckboard on the way up. They got to that river, and Mulholland looked at it and said, geez, Fred, I think you're right. There's an amazing amount of water here, and furthermore, I think we can bring that aqueduct back all this way. Mulholland, though, was the first that ever took such a concept seriously, who ever believed that such a thing that could be done. As one federal engineer who'd heard about this notion before said, this is about as lunatic a notion as Washington, D.C. tapping into the Ohio River for its drinking water. That was part of a report that went to the president. Question, so the project was not such an easy sell for Mulholland. Answer, just the opposite. A lot of people thought it could not be done, and others believed that the price tag of $23 million was too high. But Mulholland had turned the city's water company into a money-making concern that delivered what it promised to its citizens, including a 20% cut in water rates. In the end, voters were won over by the chief, as he was known. The truth is that Mulholland had that same larger-than-life persona that bad guy Noah cross projects in the movie Chinatown. It's just that Mulholland was a good guy, honest, greatly loved. Question: how did the actual building of the aqueduct go? Answer: such a thing had never been done before, and all the work took place in terra incognita. There were no roads up there, no electricity, no telephone, no water, no sources of labor. Everything had to be put in place and carried in. It was hard to keep the laborers going in such an arena as that, and the physical challenges were unprecedented. Mulholland himself admitted once, without whiskey, we would never have finished. But he also came up with a number of novel engineering techniques that had never been thought of, including the construction of massive steel siphons, the 80 to 100 inch in diameter steel pipes that were used. They looked like they were inverted siphons that were used to carry water. That you couldn't bridge these chasms, no way to hold up that kind of weight or to be able to afford to build pilings or aqueduct pilings that would carry that weight across these vast chasms. So the pipes would carry the water down the side of a cliff and starting at 100 inches in diameter and getting smaller as they went down to 80 inches, hit the water, the canyon floor, hurtle across a couple of miles in an 80-inch pipe, start up the other side of the ensuing canyon, and the pipe would expand in diameter and then hurtle to the top and keep on going down toward Los Angeles. The idea was that you could not pump that water up the side of a hill because it would have made it all, the cost of the power would have made it prohibitive, cost prohibitive. It wouldn't have been feasible, the entire project. Only gravity moves the water all the 233 miles.
Amazing.
And Mulholland laid this route out using a pocket compass and an aneroid barometer. There were no such things as altimeters. He had a transit, a surveyor's transit. But this is the guy who did it. In the end, and though there were a number of casualties, the work came in on time and under budget, largely due to Mulholland's tireless effort. You can imagine a public figure going before the public today and saying, I'm going to build the largest civil engineering, public services project of all time, and I'm going to do it using only city employees, and I'm going to bring it in on time and under budget. They'd put them away. They wouldn't give them the 23 million. Answer, or question, you'd call him a hero then, I'm guessing? Answer, I'd call him larger than life, that's for sure. But there is a tragic turn to Mulholland's story. In 1928, the St. Francis Dam that he designed and built in 1926 to store aqueduct waters burst. The flood sent a wall of water about 60 miles all the way to the Pacific and killed nearly 600 people. It remains today one of the worst disasters in California history, second only to the San Francisco earthquake and flood. At the coroner's inquest called to fix blame, Mulholland, then 72, stopped one of his questioners. Listen, he said, if you're trying to fix human error in this matter, then I'm the human. Fasten the blame on me. It was a rare stance for a public official, but that's the kind of person he was. In the end, no blame was assigned to any individual. Engineering experts debate the cause of the dam's collapse to this day. I'm told there's a new book, in fact, coming out. A couple of professors who write about dams are hoping to fix the cause. The alternate explanations are the dam was built too big to support itself. The other one was there was an unknowable fault in the schist below the dam that resulted in it. We'll see what that book says. If it wasn't a complex problem, they wouldn't be writing an entire book about it, I can tell you that one. Question. So what is the legacy of William Mulholland then? Answer. That he, a self-trained engineer motivated by what he felt was best for those around him, designed and completed a project that changed the world to an extent that could scarcely have been imagined at the time he began. His example of ingenuity, selflessness, dedication, and achievement is about as grand as it gets. Question. If he were alive today, what question might you ask him? Answer. I'd say, Mr. Mulholland, we're about to run out of water in California again. What do you think we ought to do? Charlie, well, I wish you were here to answer. Thanks for being on the show, Les. I wish we'd had you on a lot sooner. My pleasure, Charlie. Commercial. You have to amuse yourself with these things, but that's what I've been doing every time out with these books. But that, I hope, gives you a sense of what's in here. I wanted to tell a story about an amazing achievement. There wasn't a drought when I began this book about 4 years ago. I mean, other than the fact that California is a semi-arid region, most of it gets 15 inches or so of rain a year, the livable part, and a desert is designated as an area that gets 10 inches or less. And so even in a good year, Los Angeles is skirting the disaster, and there hasn't been a good year in 4 years now. They're about half of that 10-inch threshold so far, so it's a serious problem. I take up the issue toward the end of the book, but that's not really what the book about is so much as a story about a man who confronted such a crisis 100 years ago. This isn't the first time it's happened. I do hope that somebody comes along in the near future who has the same sort of vision, talent, and energy to somehow help get us out of this mess. I don't know what the answer is going to be, but Mulholland did it at the time. The fact is, though, there are no more waters to take, upside down rivers to take. Well, I don't know what's going to happen. Anyway, if you got questions or comments, I'd like to hear them.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
What's not clear to me is that the man really didn't have a formal engineering education. So, but some of the decisions he made clearly involved engineering decisions. I mean, he had the grand vision. So did he then just hire the engineers?
Oh no, I'm sorry,
designing, you can't design a dam unless you have some engineering education.
Well, he had the education. He read the books himself.
Oh, okay.
He went to Troutwine, which at the time was when he was a ditch digger, they broke a bit down by Compton trying to dig a water well, and the foreman of the crew said, "Look here, we've hit another one of those damn trees." He said, "What do you mean trees?" "Well, there are petrified trees all over the place down there, about 600 feet down." Mulholland said, it's a kid who'd never been to school. He left school when he was 8th grade, the equivalent of 8th grade. He said, "Well, how could there be a tree 600 feet below the surface of the earth?" The foreman says, "Oh, go to the library, they'll give you a book on geology and it'll explain everything." And that's what Mulholland did. And he got there'd been a new book, a groundbreaking new book by a guy who ended up being a professor of the head of the geology department at USC ultimately. And Mulholland read it, and that began the course of his education. And he trained himself to the point where he worked himself up with that private company where he was digging ditches at the time because he learned the business. And of course, learned through on-the-job training, watching the other engineers with whom he worked and asking questions because he was inquisitive and loved the one concept came to guide his entire life, and that was bringing the water to the people. That's all he ever really cared about. Certainly didn't care about money. If he had been involved with special interests, the work would have been bid out to private companies, friends of politicians and Mulholland, and money would have been siphoned off to the project in that way. That's the biggest indication that nothing fishy happened there. But that aside, your question is, he taught himself to be an engineer. But he was also a great reader of the classics, loved Shakespeare, regular attendee of the opera. One of his other quotes that I wanted to start the book off with was, "Damn a man who doesn't read books," which is sort of a startling statement for an engineer. I hope, nothing against you if you're an engineer audience. What else? Yes, sir.
Were people critical that had he had a better engineering education, that maybe the St. Francis Dam wouldn't have happened?
The attitude at the time, and then there was a pretty influential paper published in the 1990s that said that given the science of the time, there was no way that anyone could have foreseen, could have known about the fault that underlay the surface soils. It was fine. Surface layers of soil seemed great. Some people argued that Mulholland should have suspected that in territory like that, that underlying land masses should have been unstable. And the truth is, he resigned. You know, he said, I built the thing, it's my fault, and knew that that was the end of his career. But according to family sources and papers, some people like to say, oh, he retired in feeling in disgrace. He, according to the family, never felt disgraced. He just knew that as a practical matter, he could not stay on at the helm of the DWP because it just would have caused too much political turmoil. But he apparently never believed that he was responsible, even though he felt terrible that all these people had died. His name was the Mulholland Dam in Weed Canyon above Hollywood was built precisely in the same fashion. I don't want to worry anybody if you've got friends or family down there below that dam. It still stands to this day. It was built in the same way. He was the recognized dam building expert of his day and engineer, water engineer, civil engineer of his time. J. Waldo Smith, who was building the Croton Water Project in New York, came out to observe what he was doing. The engineers who were involved in the construction of the Panama Canal came out to study certain techniques of earth moving and so forth that he was using, and took them back to put them to use with the Panama on the completion of the Panama Canal. Here's a guy that never went to school. Mm-hmm. Very influential as an engineer, but also able as a public spokesman, also very able as a manager and cost accountant. He could figure out that the cost of every rivet that was driven into those pipes, 21 cents for the little ones, he calculated. Some of the rivets were almost as big as your forearm, $5.67. He could calculate how far a mule, one of a 50-mule team, could drag one of these massive pipes up the canyon to be put in place per bale of hay. How many bales of hay would it take 50 mules to move this pipe that mountainside? And he would tell the commissioners, this is how much hay we're going to need, because he had figured it out. That's what enabled him, and the fact that he was able to motivate us. He was so well liked by his men that those two qualities together allowed him to complete that project on time and under budget. Yes, ma'am.
Was he ever distressed at the increasing growth of his favorite Los Angeles as a result of his water?
Wait a minute. Ask me that. Was he ever
distressed that it was growing so big and it was all due to his?
Well, he was distressed from the beginning.
Yeah.
At first, he tried to keep ahead of the pace of growth. Then he argued against it. We have to have a reasonable cap on growth, and finally gave in because nobody paid any attention. That's what sent him into the Sierra Nevadas to begin with. And then when the population rose to 1 million by the 1920s, led to his tapping the Colorado River, the design of the Boulder Dam project. He did not oversee the construction of that. He had retired in 1928, just before construction began, but that was his idea. He thought, well, you know what, there's nothing I can do about it. This place is going to grow to 2 million, and there'll be no stopping it now. But he didn't see how possibly more than 2 million people could ever live in such a place. He was the original sustainability advocate. And population growth was the bane of his existence as a man who was charged with bringing enough water to keep the population afloat. But nobody listened then, and try to get a politician now to talk about limiting growth. That's the engine of the capitalist system, after all, continual and steady growth. So it's very difficult to get anybody to take that seriously. A lot easier to say, you know what, you people are going to have to stop watering your lawns until I say so. I don't know that that's going to make much difference. I'd like to think so, but yes, sir.
Just as a footnote, I think Jack Nicholson still lives on Mulholland Drive.
Really?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he does.
Well, Robert Town still lives down in Palos Verdes. He grew up in San Pedro, and I asked him, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to him, I said, what drew you to this story? Even though it's the melodrama is all made up. And he said, very simple, he said, everybody needs water. I thought that most mysteries, he said, are about far more complex subjects. But he said, when it occurred to me how important water was to this place, I thought I would write a mystery that was around, that was all about water.
You know which rivers he tapped? The most of them are on the east side of the Sierra, aren't they?
Yes, the California Water Project gets water from the west side of the Sierra, but the LA Aqueduct took the Owens River, which is in the Owens Valley, which is just on the other side of
Bishop? Around
yeah, Bishop is the largest city, and the Lone Pine is the second, I believe. And Mammoth Ski Area is just above that. And some of the water now comes from Mono Lake, the Mono Lake region above that. The second aqueduct that parallels the first was begun in 1940. Takes water from even further up, but it's all over there. All that water's coming there. Then the second, and it still supplies about 20% of the LA water. The rest of it comes from the Colorado Project and the California Water Project. And there's still a little bit of pumping that comes out of the LA River aquifer. Meager as it is, experts say, well, in a good year, the LA River could support about 250,000 people. And some of that water is still pumped, but it doesn't affect, doesn't support most of that population, very many of the people that live down there. Jack Nicholson still was.
I think Brando did too.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Town was very interested. He still cares a lot about this. He still goes out and talks about the water problem. Maybe not as vociferous as William Shatner, who wants to raise $30 billion and bring water down from Seattle.
I think we have time
Yes,
for
sir.
one last question.
One more?
Yeah, this is all kind of new story to me. I was raised in LA, and we were always, they told us about Mulholland, but they sort of cast him a different role. They said, yeah, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him because he brought the water in, but basically he stole it.
Well, he didn't steal it. Fred Eaton posed as a representative of the Bureau of Reclamation, that he was an employee of the Bureau of Reclamation, buying up water rights to build an irrigation project in the Owens Valley. Fred, I'm sorry to say, I believe was motivated in at least some part by self-interest, because he set aside a certain portion of water where he thought LA would have to have the water to put its reservoir to feed to keep it and feed the aqueduct. And sad to say, he was Mulholland. It so angered Mulholland that he built his reservoir at the bottom of the Owens Valley, where the land was so arid that people were so happy to have somebody offer to buy it at any price, and sort of skunked Fred Eaton, who never got over it. They didn't speak for 30 years until Eaton was on his deathbed because of this. Mulholland was honest to a fault, and the thought of any skullduggery, this is the true story. And you can read the book, I get into it. Most of what was said, this whole myth of Chinatown, as I call it, derives from remember that mayoral campaign I was talking about earlier? A guy wrote a book, a crazy book that you can still get, The Conspiracy. It's almost like a UFO book that claimed what Mulholland was doing, and that there was that the aqueduct would never work, and on and on and on and on. Mulholland was so apoplectic about this book when he was asked to respond to it. He said, "How can I respond to it? It's like responding to when did you stop beating your wife? There's not a shred of evidence." But it led to, and is cited as support by people like William Carl and Mark Reisner, as if it had some substance. I've looked at it; it's crazy. You know? But much of this attitude about Mulholland, that he was an imperious water thief, derives from this corny old source, in my opinion. And then Chinatown. People go to Chinatown, they think they've learned something about LA water.
So did I. I'm just embarrassed.
Read them.
I would have a question.
Yeah.
During your research, did you at all look at how insurance companies worked 100 years ago with liability insurance, how they kind of, I mean, today, anything you want to build, you got to look at liability insurance and how that kind of functions?
Could have been. I did not get into it, but I will say that some of the most serious opposition to the whole project in the first place, and the source of a number of rumors about Mulholland and people profiting off this, were circulated by the power companies. The Edison Company, Los Angeles Power Company, Huntington, because they were worried that the city would use the flow of the aqueduct to generate power and then drive them out of business, which, of course, they ultimately did. That was where the real money came from, in opposition to the aqueduct and to the DWP in its early days, for the electrical power interests down there. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got to compliment you on your generosity during your interview. I think 3 times you complimented the interviewer on the intelligence of his questions. No, I just had to get that in.
Well, thank you. You've been a great audience. Thank you for coming out. I hope you like the book.